I'm Ben. I'm a data protection consultant in Evalian. So that means that I regularly help clients with both meeting the regulations and data protection laws, but also assessing their compliance with those regulations. And that's kind of my day-to-day. The ICO Children's Code, otherwise known as the Age Appropriate Design Code, is a statutory code that came into force in September 2020. Organisations had about a year, or had a year from there onwards to comply with that code. And the code is a set of 15 design standards designed to basically take a privacy-centric approach with regards to handling children's information, particularly from an online perspective. So the Children's Code is all based around the providers of information society services. Information society service is a really quite broad definition, but it basically means anybody who's providing any service from a distance for any kind of commercial gain or any kind of remuneration, and that is basically accessible by an individual recipient. So in terms of how these organisations achieve funding, it doesn't necessarily have to be paid for services. It could also be that they're achieving that funding through indirect means. So if they've got adverts on their sites or something like that, then it'd also come within that scope. So this therefore means that organisations that are not-for-profit organisations, so any kind of religious organisations, sports kind of governing bodies, would also be covered by that, as well as any sort of charities. It's important to know that any counselling or preventative services are explicitly excluded from that scope. But outside of that, it captures most website providers or kind of applications as well. When we say that an information society service is one which is going to be delivered online or from a distance, this doesn't explicitly mean or solely mean that they've got to be based purely online. It could also be people who offered a kind of blended service. So in the past, case law has basically determined that a dental service who purely offers in-person services also comes within the scope of an information society service. And finally, an individual has to be accessing these services as a sole user. So if there's a broadcast going out to a kind of unlimited number of users, then that wouldn't come within the scope of an information society service. Alternatively though, it's important to note that platforms such as streaming platforms would come within that scope. Of course, beyond that, nearly every website, app, online gaming company, online game, educational kind of resource would all come within the scope of that. Any sort of public authority, however, who are offering something that's not for any sort of remuneration would be excluded. So any kind of state school educational resource wouldn't come within that scope of an information society service. The kind of next part of the test for whether or not the Children's Code applies to an organisation is whether or not their services are basically aimed at children, or if there's a chance that they could be accessed by children. It's important to know that the ICO recommends that a kind of risk-based approach is taken with this. So if there's basically any chance that a child could be accessing your let's say, website, the ICO's Children's Code or the design principles that come with it would therefore apply to you. So whilst this code isn't a kind of code enforced by law, the Data Protection Act basically says that the ICO, so the Information Commissioner's Office, who's the data protection regulator in the UK, are to basically assess compliance with the code if they're ever investigating an organisation's compliance, particularly with regards to children's data. So the importance of this is that about a fifth of internet users are children, and upon many occasions it's been found that either too much data is being taken by organisations or too much data is visible to the wider public of those, let's say, child subscribers or child users of a service. And we've seen this recently with most social media platforms, to be honest, where frequently those under 18 are being presented with options that don't promote a privacy-centric approach, and therefore basically anybody who else is using the service has access to their data in some form or another. The ICO's Children's Code or the design principles that come with it would therefore apply to you. So the first step in really assessing whether or not the code applies to you is to perform some kind of, let's say, market research, or use some form of kind of analysis to assess who's going to be visiting your, let's say, website, who's accessing your app. If it turns out that it is, let's say, people under the age of 18 and that's not the intention, then the responsibility is on the organisation to implement those changes necessary to let's say, keep a website to those who are only 16 and above, for example. The implementation of appropriate age verification basically means that if you are going to be processing children's data, and that's something which you've kind of reached that end point of saying that yes, this is the point of our service, we're meant to be targeting children, so to speak. How are you verifying their age? How confident are you in those methods? What sort of probability are we looking at for where somebody could be of a kind of lower age than what you expect to access your website, and how exactly are you capturing that? Much like the principles of the GDPR, the seventh principle is accountability, where you have to evidence compliance, and that's very much the same with the Children's Code. So the onus is always upon the organisation to evidence and demonstrate how they've met the requirements of the code, how they've reached the conclusions that these steps are appropriate or not appropriate for their website. And that's all about demonstrating that they've conducted, as I said earlier, things such as market research, looking at what potentially best practices is implemented by other bodies or other organisations who have a similar sort of target audience to them. And once they've reached that point, it's all about looking at risk, performing some kind of risk assessment to basically work out what risk is there to the children who are using their service. From our end, if we were to advise a client, we'd always say at this point it's recommended that they complete a data protection impact assessment. This is a tool which is, in some circumstances, prescribed by law, where you must complete one of these. In particular, that's going to be if you're handling the data of a vulnerable individual or a child. So obviously you can see how that ties together with the Children's Code. So conducting a DPIA will basically allow an organisation to assess the risks with their processing and hopefully mitigate those with any of the kind of design standards set out by the Children's Code. The real aim of the Children's Code, however, is for organisations to take a more proactive approach and build in what's known as data protection by default and by design. So building into their practices and their platforms, I suppose, good practice from a data protection perspective. So that's when we're looking at things such as basically nudge technology. So which way is the organisation trying to steer the user's behaviour? And this happens in nearly all organisations or all kind of user or profile creation steps where certain options are pre-selected, and regardless of what settings those are, the organisation would prefer for an adult user to choose. The Children's Code basically says that the most safe or the kind of most privacy first approach should always be the setting that's pre-selected for those individuals that they've identified as being under 18, under 16, whatever the case may be for our website. So under the GDPR, there's basically the right to be informed, and that means that individuals need to be told transparently and quite clearly how we're going to be using their personal data. So making sure that when we're presenting that information to them, commonly in the form of a privacy notice, it's done so in language which is really clear and easy to understand for that relevant age group, and where necessary, that it's clearly bringing in, let's say, any kind of parents or any kind of guardians into that conversation around how that data is going to be used. So it's important to note that whilst this is a UK-focused code, so it's a code which is brought out by the UK's Data Protection Regulatory Authority, it would apply to any organisations or any information society services who are offering their services to UK children. So whilst it initially captures just those UK-based organisations, let's say if an organisation somewhere in the EU was promoting their services to people all across Europe, they would also come within that scope, and therefore would need to comply with those kind of design principles as well.